Thank you, Nick. Now I call Scott Barrett, and after Scott, Jeffrey Sachs.
Well, thank you very much. I feel pretty intimidated, partly because I'm so far down the list of speakers that you've already heard so much. I don't know if I could add much that's new. And by the way, these speakers are real modelers, and I'm not. I'm a consumer of this information rather than a producer. So my views may be a little different. I'm also intimidated because I don't have PowerPoint. So you may wonder whether I have anything to say. And finally, I'm intimidated because I realize that I'm the only person between yourself and Professor Sachs. But I'll try to say something anyway. Ernesto Zedillo, when he opened the session this morning, said that the people at Davos had agreed in a poll that climate change was the world's greatest problem. And Ernesto said that he wasn't sure if it was...
He said that I don't agree.
He was sure that he did not agree with that.
That they are wrong.
Well, when I was visiting at the Yale Center last year, I was working on lots of global problems, of which climate was one. I'm also not sure I am not sure that climate is the biggest, but what I am absolutely sure of is that it's the most complicated. I've worked on this not as long as some people here, but a long time, and it's an incredibly complicated problem. And the thing about the Stern report that really struck me was that it had reduced something that was incredibly complicated to a very simple recommendation and a very unambiguous recommendation. Now, since the report came out, Nick and his team have produced this postscript, and I think that addresses my initial reaction to a large extent to the report. But I still think that there's a great service that's being provided by the Stern Review, and that is to draw attention to the ethics of this problem. And also, I think there may be an inconsistency within the review itself about how ethics are treated. And my guess is that Nick may even agree with me about this, but we'll see. The choice we have here is really about people taking actions now that will have consequences a long time into the future. In the Stern Review, the real damages start to appear after 2050, and then they mount to 2100, 2200. And this is, everyone understands that this is the nature of this problem. So when we speak about taking action now, you're talking about taking something away from the current generation and giving it to the future generation. So you're thinking about well-beings in different periods of time, and that's why this is such a profound ethical issue. Now, there are two ways, as we've heard before, about how you treat well-being in these different places, and one is this delta, this pure rate of time preference, and why should we treat people differently just because they exist in the future? Well, actually, Nick says that we should treat them a little differently simply because there's a small probability that they may not exist. And he cites as examples of this the possibility of the Earth being slammed by an asteroid and of a terrible global pandemic. Well, actually, while I was at the Yale Center, I was working on these two problems, and pleased to tell you that actually we can do things to address these problems too. So maybe that pure rate of time preference could even be a little smaller. The other thing that's going on here is that between now and the future, more is going to change than just the climate. And the thing that changes in the model that Nick uses is per capita consumption. And it rises quite dramatically over time. And the reason it rises so much is the effect of compound growth. In fact, if I've understood things correct, the future, even with climate change, is better off than the present in terms of per capita consumption. So what he's asking is that the current generation make sacrifices for the future when the future is going to have a higher per capita consumption level. And you can see why this is an important issue for ethics, because it really raises this issue about the concern that we should have for equity. Now, when you, as everyone has said before, the parameter that represents a concern for equity is this eta parameter. And Nick chooses a value that is relatively low. I think, by the way, that the choices of these parameters, the pure rate of time preference and the eta, are best thought of as social choices and not so much choices for me or for anyone else to make in particular. There are a number of ways in which you could think about this eta. In any event, it seems relatively low. And the reason, as we've heard before, that the current generation should make sacrifices for the future is because even though the future's much better off than we are, we don't care so much about equity. If you cared more about equity, you'd want to have the current generation, which is poor, sacrifice less. Now, this is only part of the story, though, because if you read the text very carefully, it's clear that Nick Stern is very concerned about equity. In fact, what he basically is saying that we should take steps now. He's saying that the rich countries today should take steps now to reduce the extent of climate change, particularly as it affects poor countries in the future. Okay. So on the one hand, you have a current relatively poor generation making sacrifices for a relatively richer generation in the future. On the other hand, in the text, you have today's richer countries making sacrifices for today's poorer countries in the future. Okay, so there seems to be a slight inconsistency, and I think the inconsistency arises because the Stern review is kind of straitjacketed by the model. And the model allows, if I've understood things correctly, as Nick has used it, interactions between rich and poor societies only through emissions. So if you had a concern about equity, the only way you could do it, if I've understood things correctly, is you reduce emissions now to help the poor countries in the future. There's no other way you could do it. Now, what I want to suggest is that there are other ways that we could do it. One of the, I'm just going to give you one example. One of the effects of climate change that people are concerned about, quite rightly, is on malaria and on the spread of malaria. Now, the best paper I've seen on this suggests that by around 2100, the prevalence of malaria might rise about 5%. Okay, and basically that's happening because malaria, the ecosystems are tolerating the vector higher up the hillsides. It's basically on altitude that malaria would spread. So if we reduce emissions, we would reduce the increase in malaria a century and more ahead. But there's another way to think about this, and that is that if we did something like develop the malaria vaccine, and I'm thinking about this more as a metaphor than as something to be taken entirely literally, but you could, through a malaria vaccine, you could reduce malaria across the board, and you could do it much sooner. And my point is that if you're going to if you're going to increase the eta because you're concerned with equity, and that means that the social cost of carbon comes down and therefore you do less abatement now, you also have to recognize that concern about equity to have its effects somewhere else. Okay, you can't just sort of narrow it one way and leave everything else the same. And I think the case about equity then is not only partially about reducing abatement for the future, it's also about doing more than just reducing emissions. It's providing for adaptation. Adaptation we normally think of as being, well, the seas rise, let's build higher dikes. But actually, I think a better way to think about adaptation is making particularly the poorer countries less vulnerable to climate change or more resilient. And investments in technologies like malaria vaccines would do that. Now, I think Nick is very aware of this, and he's, of course, very concerned about development. And in his postscript, he refers to this problem of development assistance, and he says that he's basically relying on pledges that the richer countries have made to developing countries being realized in the future. And I have 5 comments to make about that. The first is that I hope he's right. I hope it is forthcoming. The second is that pledges aren't always fulfilled. The third is that the issue is less money than what is actually achieved by the money, of course. The fourth is, though, and this is important, that adaptation and mitigation, they are interrelated, and so they really should be co-determined. If countries are going to get away with doing less mitigation, for example, then that really means there needs to be more adaptation. And we know that the poor countries are relatively the most vulnerable and will need assistance. So those two things, I think, should be coupled. And finally, and this is quite important, and it was brought out by a lovely op-ed that Jagdish Bhagwati wrote, there is an obligation, and Nick has said this before too, for the richer countries to help the poorer countries. So we think about development assistance in a way that's driven a lot by compassion. And compassion, unfortunately, is rather in short supply. But here the motivation would be a little different. It would be a recognition of an obligation, a responsibility to help countries that would be harmed by the actions of the industrialized countries in the past. Now, the real big question, I think, is not whether we act now or not. I think everyone agrees we should act now. It's really much more about what can we do. And I'm just going to suggest very briefly that what we need to think about are 5 different things. First is, I agree with Nick that you want countries to take action now, and probably the way to think about it is they'll do it on their own, and that they'll be looking over each other's shoulders, and I would actually rather they did this through an international agreement, simply because you create a kind of normative standard for what countries ought to do about this problem. But what I think you can't do is rely on strong-armed enforcement at the international level, particularly for this problem. I think that would be very difficult. So I think he's right that you probably want to rely more on domestic enforcement. I think internationally, naming and shaming, but I think the idea of having strong enforcement is probably going to be difficult. That means that this approach can only get us up so high. Okay, and I think everyone agrees that we want to do more than just going up a bit, particularly in the longer run. So that's why more things need to be done. So the second thing that is really quite important is that we invest substantially in R&D. Actually, the way to think about this is if you're going to have a material effect on the climate, you basically have to transform energy technology worldwide. Okay, this is something we've never done before. This is unprecedented. And this is a huge challenge for us. But the technologies that we're going to need don't really exist. So they need to be, we need basic research in this to discover and to develop these technologies. Then, this is the third thing, we need a mechanism to diffuse these technologies worldwide. Because if you have the ideas, you know how to do it, and it's not distributed, it won't do any good. So those two things also are linked. The third thing is we need to do adaptation. And as I suggested, I think adaptation needs to be thought of much more broadly than just building dikes. I think it's a lot more than that. And adaptation we should be doing now for that reason. We should be making poorer countries especially more resilient. The R&D we should do now, short-term mitigation we should do now. Now the last thing I think we should think about is probably a wrong thing to suggest at the very end of a talk, because it's an awkward, in many ways bizarre idea. It's called geoengineering. And the idea here is that you could deliberately alter the climate. Now, I know this is kind of scary. You first hear it, it sounds bizarre. But actually, the technology has been examined by a number of people. It looks like it's feasible. And it has a kind of a mixed kind of effect. On the one hand, it's the only way in which you could possibly stop abrupt and catastrophic change from happening after you started to see it beginning. And that's a good thing about it. However, you're then undertaking another kind of experiment, and we don't know what the full consequences of that would be. One of the interesting, and it would not address ocean acidification that was mentioned before, but one of the problems with geoengineering is that the economics are in a way so attractive that a more fundamental problem arises for governance. Who's to decide when and under what conditions geoengineering ought to be used? This, which you may not have heard much about, I think is an issue and a technology on the horizon. And what we really need is a governance structure that will prepare us for that as well. Thank you very much.
just a couple points. I think clearly Nick's report has had a huge political effect, and it's proven again the endogeneity of Davos polling, by the way, which shifts from world's most important topic systematically year by year, depending on what the most interesting headline was the month before. And the Stern review was the most interesting headline the month before, and the Davos community has duly gotten in line, which is all to the good, except it won't last 2 years in a row. So you better get the results you need this year. I'm wondering how much disagreement there really is in the rhetoric on the panel. That's my main question, and it's a little bit hard to know, because most of the discussion is how fast should we do what we need to do? And is Nick calling for a crash course in doing something while the rest of us are calling for something more gradual, or mainstream says do it gradually and Nick's saying do it in a crash course? I certainly didn't feel when I read the report that that's really what it was about. I read Nick's call to action as let's get started now, understanding that this will take decades. Now, maybe I have not interpreted correctly the report. If it didn't say that, that's what it should have said. But my view is that it did say that. And there are incredibly powerful reasons for putting it that way. And that is that we're talking about changing the core infrastructure of the world economy, and it will take several decades to do. To do it faster than that really would impose marginal costs, which would be extraordinarily hard to justify on the scientific evidence, because the scientific evidence suggests, at least as we know it now, that if we act with all deliberate speed right now, planning by mid-century to really have completed a huge changeover, we will have been able to keep the dangerous emissions below catastrophic level. And since Nick talks about stabilizing at 450 to 550, and that's possible on a scenario of all deliberate speed, taking into account the time horizons of demonstration and investment in long-lived infrastructure, that's what I took the report to be. What's also true is if you wait another 20 years, then the window closes on certain concentration levels, and you can't any longer at all deliberate speed reach 450 to 550 level. Now, there is one major confusion which I think should have been straightened out in the report and still should be straightened out, will be straightened out inevitably in the discussions. Nick's talking about 450 to 550 parts per million carbon equivalent, meaning adding up all of the greenhouse gases. There's a little E at the bottom. All the rest of us are talking about parts per million of carbon. And this is a big difference, actually. And so it's not clear what really is going on here, because the study is overwhelmingly about carbon and only very little about the movements of the other radiative forcing gases. I'm quite happy with the 450 to 550 ppm carbon target. I'm not sure, I don't have the same Bayesian confidence in my views about a 450 to 550 ppm carbon equivalent level, and I'd like to know a little bit more about that. The scientists at the Earth Institute argue strongly for keeping these separate in terms of public discussion and understanding, and not simply adding the radiative forcings. And for good economic reasons, we can understand why not to lump them together as well, for many, many reasons. They need different prices, they have different systems, they have different residence times in the atmosphere. And it is a little bit of a mess, I think, to have a target that is adding up 6 or more greenhouse gases this way. But if we could then stipulate, I'm going to stipulate from now on, I'm talking about 450 to 550 parts per million carbon rather than carbon equivalent. It would take it would take a profoundly dislocating set of actions to achieve that before, to aim to stabilize below such levels, for example. And on the other hand, if we start now, it would be possible to stabilize in that range without severe dislocation. One thing that almost none of the models formally takes into account is the true putty clay nature of almost everything we live with. Our fleet of automobiles turns over in 20 years. Our power plants turn over in 40 to 50 years or longer. Our residential structures, 50 years to 100 years, and similarly with our commercial structures. In general, everything can be retrofit, but it's a heck of a lot more expensive to retrofit than it is to invest in the prospective phase for decarbonizing energy or reducing emissions in other ways. And so the low marginal cost pathway is one that takes the easy wins, of course, where you can find them, and there's a lot of waste in the system, but then invests as you roll off old capital and roll on new capital. Some of it's literally the rolling stock of our automobile fleet. Most importantly, it's the stock of our power plants. If we were to decommission live, existing, well-functioning coal plants right now and build wholly new power plants, that'd be really expensive, actually. It would be a huge change. If we took a view instead that as power plants are mothballed or new ones are built, that they satisfy the constraints of being carbon effective or carbon efficient, then we'll be able to manage the transformation at a much, much lower marginal cost. So I think any serious scenario takes into account a path that's going to last 30, 40, 50 years. And I took the message from the Stern review that if we're going to take these limits seriously, which we should, we've got to get started now, because every new power plant that's being built, and there are gigawatts of power plants that are being built right now, with old-fashioned coal thermal-fired plants all through China, India, and a lot of the rest of the world, we're going to lock ourselves into a time path which will be devastating. But if we get started now so that as the capital is reinvested, it's invested in efficient ways, the marginal cost of that transformation will be quite low. Now, my view is it's going to be a lot lower than in Bill Nordhaus's model, which I take to be the state-of-the-art workhorse model of the profession. And I'm a lot more optimistic about this, and I'll try to explain why. In fact, whenever I disagree with Bill Nordhaus, I worry intensely about why that might be, because he's about the most reasonable person I know. And so I spent a lot of time in the last few months, as he knows, sending him lots of emails to try to understand the assumptions underneath the DICE model. And my view is that when the DICE model, which is a good, standard, simple workhorse model, but you got to still put in parameters to have it come out with sensible answers, when you do that with what I think are better parameters than the ones that Bill uses, this debate turns out, in my opinion, not to be very much about the time discount rate at all. It just turns out to be about the parameters that one's assuming about mainly the costs of adjustment and several other basic features about the world economy, not profound features, but just basic assumptions that are being made. Now, I may have everything wrong that I'm about to say, but I'm going to do my best on this, and then I apologize in advance if I do have it wrong. But Bill's basic point in comparison, say, with what I would adopt as let's get started now, get started seriously, and reach 2050 with the chance of ending up the century at 500 or 550 ppm and not going above that. Bill's model says, no, we should do this over 2 centuries, and we can breach 550, maybe we'll go to 600 or 700, and that's the right thing to do. Eventually, we will stabilize, but we don't have to do it within a century, and we don't have to do it at the limits that Nick is talking about. So I take Nick to be saying, let's get on with it so that by 2050, we're still within, maybe at 450 ppm, And that gives us a chance that by 2100, we're still at 500 to 550 ppm. And Bill's model's saying, no, we can go above that, be more gradual. Maybe we'll do 25% abatement control by the end of the century, 30%, 40%, but still we'll breach these limits. So I tried to figure out why that is. And one thing that's interesting about the low levels of control, and I think the sense of lack of urgency that comes from the DICE model, is that the baseline path of emissions is actually quite a bit lower than the rest of us assume. Bill's baseline of no control only reaches 610 ppm of carbon by 2100. And I don't know of another model that's anywhere close to that in terms of such a low level. But if that's your baseline, you don't feel urgent about control because the world's already more or less controlling these things for you. And the reason seems to be, if I understand it, four assumptions that I don't like very much in the model. One is that the baseline level of economic growth assumed is only about 2% or so. So the rate of growth of the world economy is, it may be right, but it seems to me not the right base for policy decision making, because we should presume that China and India are going to grow quickly, and that that's really the core of our issue right now, is that there's going to be a lot more carbon coming from that fact. Second, and again, I apologize if I got it wrong, but the population assumption is just way out of the norm. It's 7.7 billion by 2050, whereas the medium forecast of the UN, which right or wrong I would take to be the right medium place to start an assumption like this, is 8.9 billion. Then there's an economic assumption, two economic assumptions. One, which is better than it was in an earlier variant, is that there's a lot of automatic decarbonization that goes on in the model over the long term. It's less than it used to be. It used to be 100% automatic decarbonization at no pain in 3 centuries. Now it's substantial decarbonization at the end of 2 centuries. So you end up getting to a point where you don't really have to control things, because technology at zero marginal cost controls a lot of it already. But then the fourth point, I think, is that the assumed abatement cost for actually doing something is just much too high. And this is the nub of the issue, actually. I think we focused much too much time in this discussion over the last 10 weeks on the discount rate, as if that's the only thing really going on. Whereas what seems to me to be going on even more is the assumption of how much is it going to cost to clean this stuff up. In Bill's model, if I get it, there's a parameter for that, which is time varying. But as of mid-century, the parameter is such that it implies that 100% abatement would cost 3.9% of GNP, and 75% abatement would be 1.7% of GNP. I'm living among technological optimists in the Earth Institute, a world of engineers, who think that that 1.7% is roughly 5 times too high. And I'll explain that in a minute. But if you change that assumption and say that you can do 75% abatement at something like 0.6% of GNP, you get a completely different judgment on this. It has nothing to do with the time discount. It's actually what's the cost of doing what we need to do. And I think that that's really, in the end, what makes the models fly. Now, here's my attempt to put in an alternative set of estimates. The lowest line is Bill Nordhaus's optimum trajectory on his baseline parameters. And as of 2050, there's 0.2 abatement, meaning that you abate 20% of the emissions that would normally be there. And by 2100, you abate about 37%. And 2120, it's a little bit above 40%. So the path is, like everyone would agree, it's upward sloping. Eventually, you would reach 100%, assuming that, that technological change for free doesn't do it for you. But it's a very gradual course. If you start changing these assumptions First, change the cost estimate to make it less costly. And then two very basic things: let the world economy grow faster. Basically, let China and India catch up with a Barrow catching up coefficient, rather than almost no catching up, which seems to be, or very slow catching up, which seems to be assumed, which puts the world economy on a 5% per year growth path right now, rather than Bill's of something like 2%. Then you get a much higher trajectory, and the message is control this damn stuff. It's pouring out of the smokestacks. And so when I add in a revised cost adjustment, plus a faster growth, plus the UN population assumption, I get that by 2060, we're at 60% abatement, and by 2080, we're at 100% abatement in the DICE model. I would say to get that, we'd have to have a worldwide agreement now to be able to make a transformation like that. That's what I would claim to be underpinning a call to action. Maybe it doesn't feel that way, but if you're really going to have a whole world system with a dramatically larger world economy that has sharply lower emissions than it has right now, you better get started now, because the number of thermal plants that China and India are going to be building in the next 20 years would absolutely make that impossible unless you get started now. What does it mean to get started now, by the way? Here's, I think, where the cost issue comes in. Again, I live around very optimistic engineers, but I kind of believe them. And I think that, Bob Mendelssohn's analogy was all wrong on this, which is to say we can only have 3% productivity growth. After all, agriculture is so important, is only 2%. For agriculture, we've been trying to do this since 10,000 years ago. For carbon concentration, we've worried about it as engineers about 3 years. There's a lot of catching up space right now. This is literally a problem that not a single generation of students went through to worry about. Now all of a sudden they have a playground. Control that carbon. With all of the technology that you have in the world, we're going to see huge, huge, huge opportunities at low cost. Now, you know, my colleagues are very keen on a few things. One, nuclear, that's already proved. There are issues about it, but whether we like it or not, China and India and many other places are going to go nuclear. And that's going to solve a lot of this problem at quite low cost, maybe even at zero marginal cost compared to a baseline of thermal. But carbon capture and sequestration is the second very obvious technology. If you look at the IPCC report that came out on carbon capture and sequestration, they put at extremely high likelihood there are enough sedimentary geological sites to safely sequester centuries of, that is gigatons and gigatons of carbon dioxide. And their cost estimate is $10 to $30 per ton of CO2, roughly 1 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. Very low marginal cost technology. Now, we don't know if it works yet. And so if I were choosing the decision tree right now, the first thing I would do is get some of these prototype plants up and a heck of a lot of geologists around them measuring tracer gases coming out of the deposits to see whether they're leaking or not. But this, to me, is the very first step. If we can't do CCS, we got a real problem. There's no question about it. The next best technology is a lot worse than carbon capture and sequestration. But we're never going to learn that from our models, by the way. We're only going to learn that by putting that into demonstration projects and seeing whether this technology, which for good engineering reasons mechanically works, the question is whether it geologically works. I think the mechanics are quite well understood. It's the geology that needs to be proved. Now, if it turns out, and then there's one other major area for huge, huge improvement, of course, and that's automobiles. Because we already know that a plug-in hybrid system can work off the existing infrastructure and at quite low cost, probably, I'd say quite likely, zero or negative social cost, because you trade off higher battery costs and lower lower petroleum or carbon costs, and the net trade at $60 a barrel of oil is favorable at any fairly low interest rate, there may be zero social costs to switching over if performance and so forth, if the hedonic aspects of plug-in hybrids are viewed as acceptable. So the point is there are some major technologies, large scale, and this isn't even mentioning, cellulosic ethanol and other biofuels and solar and other things which have huge, huge potential. But just the proven technologies right now, if the carbon capture and sequestration works, not the engineering of it, but the stability of it, if that works, we're in a world of $25 or $30 per ton carbon dioxide on the margin for maybe up to 60 or 70% of the reduction of the total abatement in the economy. And if CCS works, it also allows one other major thing to be done, and that's to convert existing local site-based fossil fuel users like heat pumps, like furnaces and boilers into electricity users where the electricity is cleanly produced. And the costs of that kind of conversion, say, houses from home heating oil or natural gas to heat pumps powered by electricity coming from a clean power plant, are quite favorable as well. What's the bottom line of all of that? If you take an assumption that on the margin, or not on the margin, just on the average, I should say, that for all of the tons of CO2 that need to be gotten rid of off of a baseline can be disposed of at $25 a ton of CO2. Turns out that the costs of doing that for the world economy is 0.3 of 1% of GNP. And the technologies that I said just now that I mentioned, from plug-in hybrids to carbon capture sequestration and nuclear by themselves, are all $25 to $30 per ton of CO2 or less, and available right now. And this doesn't even count the huge amount of concentrated solar and PV solar and other technologies that are likely to come about. Now, if that's right, it does suggest a very simple policy prescription, and that's to put on a $25 per ton of carbon for the next 40 years. And my view is that that would lead, plus all the R&D and D that needs to be done. Basically, it's the second D of R&D and D. We need demonstration projects more than anything right now, because we have close to market technologies that need to be demonstrated. But if you do those two things, my guess is that we'd see a massive conversion of the power sector, especially in the rapidly growing developing countries. And I have done little simple experiments that if you allocate the rights to emission on an equal per capita basis, for example, so that 0.3 of world GNP is distributed to be paid more by the rich countries than the poor countries, the U.S. share of that turns out to be, or the U.S. cost turns out to be about 0.7 of 1% of U.S. GNP, assuming a $25 per ton carbon dioxide abatement cost. To me, this is really the essence of the story. How much is it going to cost to do this? We can't figure it out peering into an economic model. We have to do it by thinking about how to promote a system of technological change, and we have to talk to the engineers a lot more than we do to understand what the existing options are and what their marginal costs are. Notice, by the way, that all the things like wind and other things which are also proven and low cost at a niche can be factored in to do some small part of it. They're not the marginal solution. They are an inframarginal solution, but they add to this low cost. So for me, the bottom line is the following. I think on a pretty robust set of parameters, where you realize that the technology is not that expensive and not likely to be that expensive. You realize, different from Bob's point, I would say, that the chances for major technological improvements are enormous right now, because this is really a playground for engineers. If you ask me, could they make energy far more efficient? I doubt it. Can they make carbon less, can they decarbonize? I'd say yes, because that's a new problem. Energy efficiency is an ancient problem, but decarbonization is a brand new problem. And so I think that there are so many margins to work on that the marginal costs of this are going to be quite small. My guess is that I'll make one final prediction here. Last year when I came here, I said this was about to be mainstream because I just thought that the balance of costs and benefits are such that this will be the case. I predict that by 2010 we have a post-Kyoto international agreement that has a global agreed target for mid-century on CO2 ppm, not CO2e ppm, but CO2 ppm, perhaps 500 or so, maybe shouldn't be 550 for mid-century. It should be aiming to stabilize below 2 times pre-industrial carbon. I think we're actually going to get there. My guess is that next year, every American presidential candidate will have a very strong climate change policy in their platform, both sides of both parties. What's happening at the political level is that we'll enter into post-Kyoto negotiations in December of this year at the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Bali in December. That'll open a debate that will last through the US presidential elections and through the Chinese Olympics. Nothing's going to happen next year on this. And then in 2009, there'll be a new president, there will be post-Olympic cleanup and hangover, and China and the United States are going to agree on a, I should say US, China, and India are going to agree 3 ways on how to share the costs on doing this, and in 2010, the post-Kyoto Protocol will be signed, takes 2 years to ratify. It will go into effect January 1, 2013. Thank you very much.
Jeff, your optimism has been recorded. So, okay, so you are challenged to be back in a few years' time. Nick, you want to react now?
I have very little to add on those two. I enjoyed them both very much. Just one remark on what Scott said about the importance of acting to support developing countries in their development, including, for example, on malaria. I would be there and have been there, and I agree entirely. The only remark I would make would be that we know that whatever we do is bound to leave poor countries, basically because what will pull them out of poverty is their own actions, but there are things that we can do to help. And however much we do it, however much we do deliver on the kinds of aid commitments which I hope will in fact be delivered on, they're still going to be much poorer than we are over the next 30, 40, 50 years. So we should act to reduce those inequalities, to support developing countries in their plans for development, but it's going to leave the problem of inequality still pretty severe. So it doesn't actually take it away, but basically I didn't have anything more to add than that. I just enjoyed listening to them both, and I loved Jeff's story at the end, and I was looking at Siobhan Peters down in the front row, who led the team here, and she's been involved in Gleneagles and Kyoto and UNFCCC negotiations, the best part of the last few years. And I couldn't quite interpret the smile on her face, as you would have.